Hello, world history students. This is the third section of chapter 14, which is about the crisis in the 17th century. And this video is about absolutism as a response to that crisis. So, the question you're going to have to answer is what is absolutism? Which states, and in this case, by states, we mean countries, not US states or anything like that, practice it and how. So, you may be able to predict by this point in this unit, we're talking mostly about France, Spain, and England, because these are the great powers of this time period, and eventually the colonial powers, which is part of the reason we're looking at them. So, this absolutely spectacular image is of the Hall of Mirrors in the Palace of Versailles. So, the Palace of Versailles is, in the area of modern day Metro Paris in the 17th century, so the 1600s and the 1700s. This was in the countryside. So King Louis moves his court to this place, and I just want you to imagine if you, even just you yourself, were walking in this room to go meet somebody whose office was at the end of that hallway. What would that do to your state of mind? How would you react to it? And being a little overawed is not an unreasonable reaction, which is kind of the point. This is a symbol of the absolute power of King Louis XIV, who nicknamed himself the Sun King. So, Louis is considered the best example of absolutism, which is a system in which a monarch holds total power. Like anything, it's really never entirely true. You, for example, even if this was a fascist state, you would still have control over what was going on inside your brain, right? So, like, the idea of absolutism is a philosophical question as much as anything else, but the philosophical stance of the French state under Louis was that the divine right of kings, if God makes him, a monarch, and God is all powerful, then therefore monarchs have absolute power. And so it really is tied into this idea that the king is above the law. So Louis is, famous because he kind of is the prototype. He's a really great tool for historians to describe this idea. France basically was in a lot of trouble after the Wars of Religion. There's a map kind of going through history behind me showing the gains and losses of France. And under King Louis, you basically have France become the center of Europe, even though it's on the western edge of the physical continent. Lingua franca, the French language becomes the dominant language of diplomacy. Every big problem in Europe becomes something that France is dealing with. And this is, again, a pretty remarkable transformation. Ironically enough, for a country where supposedly the monarch is absolute, King Louis was, when he became king after his father died, he is a boy. And so he can't operate the apparatus of government in an absolutist state. He's got his chief minister, the Cardinal Richelieu, as a, kind of power behind the throne. The Cardinal and his later successor, Mazarin, both worked with Louis and basically set up the state for him to take over completely when he became an adult. So he established a secret police that would arrest people that criticized the king or were found dissenting against the state in France. The Protestants had their religion protected by the Edict of Nantes, in the centuries right after the War of Religion. And he revokes the Edict of Nantes, promises to protect the rights of Protestants, but now they can't serve in government. They can't get government jobs. They're not eligible for additional titles of land. And so it really makes France a solidly Catholic country. And that's kind of the deal between the church and the state in France. So here's Louis. There's a picture of him. You may remember that we used a photo of him as the beginning of this whole unit. Just what is this unit about? Well, we've got these absolute monarchs kind of running the show in Europe. So Louis is 23 when he declares himself the Sun King. And this is an image of him when he's younger in his 20s. He's wearing, the royal symbols of France, the blue color and the fleur-de-lis on the fabric. He's showing off his legs because that's considered to be important to him. And he builds that palace we saw in the first image in this unit. He basically does absolutely rule the country. Local officials do what he wants to because he's got all the money, and so he bribes them, even though legally he doesn't have that absolute power because there's various rights to smaller cities and such in France. He persecutes those Protestants who still legally have protection, and 200,000 flee the country, including, incidentally, the ancestors of Paul Revere, who plays a major role in the French Revolution. I'm sorry, the American Revolution, with his depiction of the Boston Massacre. Um, Louis does all of this because nobody says no when the king asks you for a loan. The king, Louis, puts this debt for all his projects onto the credit card, effectively, of France. And so, yeah, the absolute monarch says the country, basically runs because he tells it to, but future generations end up having to pay for what Louis did. And that's for many, that Hall of Mirrors we saw in some ways causes the French Revolution, which happens and ends up ending the French monarchy, at least temporarily. So, absolutism in Central Europe basically means absolutism in what were called back then the Germanies, which is effectively the equivalent of the Holy Roman Empire. You hear Holy Roman Empire, think Germany, but not really. It's not in what's called a nation state, meaning a country that exists because to represent one cultural group. These people speak different languages, but there's many, many, many different flavors of what it means to be German. They wouldn't even recognize themselves as being part of the same country. It'd be a confusing question to ask them. The two main players, the ones that are going to matter in the 19th century and in our modern history that you may still even recognize, are Austria, which is still a nation on the map, and Prussia, which is not. But Prussia is going to be the country that ends up making the modern state of Germany. So you can see, if you look closely on this map, Brandenburg is the core of the Prussian state. I won't go into what where the name Prussia comes from right this second. Suffice to say, it has to do with the Middle Ages. But in any case, Prussia builds a large military, tiny country, flat, defenseless, fourth largest army in Europe. And to pay for this army, it requires taxes. And taxes require a government both to collect the taxes, but also to justify to people why their taxes are being collected with other services other than the military. Eventually, Prussia is the first country with a social security system, for example, even though it's really a state focused on the army. The Habsburgs in Austria managed to expand the country of Austria, which is, the crown of the Holy Roman Empire is in Austria. So nominally, the rulers of Austria are the rulers of Prussia, but because of the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, at the end of the Holy Roman Empire's war of religion, they no longer have control. So Germany doesn't become a country in a lot of ways because of the wars of religion for hundreds of years until 1870, when you have nations like France, which we recognize on a map today, that didn't have the same level of continual conflict about religion. So both two successful dynasties. So in Russia, similar story as into Eastern Europe, and frankly, one of the more important stories in Europe because of what we know that happens in later history. The state, so kind of like in Germany, there's an idea of a Rus, which is not the same thing as Russia, that is this people that are similar and have a similar culture. They're conquered by the Mongols, and then the Mongols disappear, and there's a bunch of little tiny countries left over. The state around Moscow, Muscovy, is led by someone named Ivan IV, later known as Ivan the Terrible, and he declares himself the first emperor of Russia, which is a new nation state centered around Eastern Orthodox Christianity and basically absolutist rule by the Tsar, which is the Russian word for emperor, coming from the old Roman Empire of the 1453 collapse. The dynasty that replaces the original dynasty of Russia, the Rukharid dynasty, is the Romanov dynasty, and Michael Romanov's chosen as Tsar in 1689. And that's the last time the Russians vote on their monarch until they, I guess, vote with revolution in 1917's communist revolution during World War I. So Russia becomes a gigantic state, and a kind of actual parallel you can see on the map of the brown of the westward expansion of the United States. Same time period, really, in a lot of ways. Native tribes and such fought by Russians pushing east, while America, for example, is pushing west. This is the brand new capital of Russia under Peter the Great. He names the city after himself on the shores of the Baltic Sea because it's got a less icy port than other Russian ports. And I show you this picture of it covered in ice because that happens about a quarter of the year. And he's trying to make Russia more European because he basically saw how rich the west of Europe was, and he wants Russia to be more like that. Um, he takes a lot of bad lessons from Europe too. Like, so you can see lovely architecture. That's all very nice. Builds sewers in the city of St. Petersburg. That's also good. But he builds a police state kind of like in France. And so, as well as a navy, spends a, peasants are drafted for 25 years at a time. So if you're living in a small town like a Hatfield or something and the army recruiter comes, you're being recruited forcibly for longer than you guys have even lived. So that's a pretty extreme kind of absolutist regime. And he's doing this all because he sees Russia as being weak compared to these Western countries who are developing colonies and wealth from, frankly, those colonies in America. So Russia's trying to play catch up. Okay.